wind off the sea always tasted of salt and ancient promises in the small, cliffside village of Oakhaven. For generations, the villagers had built their stone houses high above the rocky shores, listening to the eternal pulse of the tide. But lately, the ocean had grown restless, its waves crashing against the cliffs with an angry, thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of their homes. The old legends spoke of a time when the waters were kept calm by a sacred melody, a song known as the lullaby of the ocean waves, but that song had been lost to the tides long ago. In the heart of this village lived Lyra, a young woman whose red hair mirrored the copper hues of autumn leaves and whose green eyes held the depth of the sea itself. She wore a simple dress of ocean blue linen, frayed at the hem from long walks along the rocky coast. While others feared the sea's growing fury, Lyra felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the water. She was a weaver of melodies, playing a small, hand-carved wooden harp she had inherited from her mother. Her fingers danced across the strings, seeking a tune that could match the restless rhythm of the tide. High above the village, perched on the highest peak of the jagged cliffs, stood the ancient stone lighthouse. Its beacon had been dark for a decade, ever since the old keeper, Kalen, had retired to a life of silent isolation. Kalen was a weathered man with silver hair like sea foam and storm-blue eyes that had seen too many shipwrecks. He wore a heavy wool navy coat that smelled of pine and salt, and he rarely spoke, his voice having been stolen by a terrible storm years before. Yet, he watched the sea with a protective vigilance that never wavered. The sky had been cast in a heavy, bruise-colored gray for 3 days, and the tides were rising higher than anyone had ever seen. The water swallowed the sandy beach, then the lower docks, and now it lapped hungrily at the base of the cliffs. The village elders whispered of the great spring tide, a rare celestial alignment that would bring waves large enough to drown Oakhaven. Fear hung thick in the air, stifling the laughter of children and the songs of the fishermen. Everyone knew that without the ancient lullaby, the sea would reclaim the land. Lyra sat by her window, her fingers tracing the cold wood of her harp. She could hear the waves pounding below, a relentless beat that sounded like a warning. She closed her eyes and tried to play a soothing melody, but the music felt thin and fragile against the roar of the tempest. Her mother had once told her that the lullaby was not just a song, but a conversation between the earth and the deep waters. To find it, one had to listen to the ocean's voice, not just its noise, and understand its sorrow. Determined to find a way to save her home, Lyra decided to climb the steep, winding path to the lighthouse. The wind whipped her red hair across her face, and the salt spray stung her eyes, but she pressed on, clutching her harp tightly to her chest. She believed that Kalen, who had lived closer to the sea than anyone else, might hold the key to the lost song. As she reached the heavy oak door of the lighthouse, a massive wave crashed against the rocks below, sending a plume of white spray high into the air. She knocked on the weathered door, the sound muffled by the howling wind. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing Kalen's tall, slightly bent figure. His storm-blue eyes looked down at her with a mixture of surprise and concern. He looked at her copper hair, then at the wooden harp in her arms, and a flicker of recognition passed over his rugged face. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter the warmth of the tower, away from the biting chill of the oncoming storm. Inside, the lighthouse was filled with the smell of burning driftwood and old parchment. The walls were lined with shelves holding strange seashells, brass instruments, and dusty journals. Kalen offered her a cup of hot herbal tea, his hands steady despite his advanced years. Lyra took the cup, grateful for the warmth. She sat down on a wooden stool near the hearth, where a fire crackled softly, offering a fragile sanctuary against the howling gale outside. She looked at the old man, pleading with her eyes for answers. Lyra set her tea aside and gently plucked a chord on her harp, the sound ringing clear and sweet in the small room. She explained that she wanted to learn the lullaby of the ocean waves to soothe the angry waters. Kalen sat across from her, his expression turning solemn. He reached for a leather-bound journal on the mantelpiece, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. He opened it to a page containing hand-drawn musical notes and ancient symbols, pointing to the faded ink with a calloused finger. The journal belonged to the first keepers of the light, who had kept the peace with the sea. Kalen pointed to the first stanza, then the second, and then the third, tapping his chest to indicate he remembered them. But when his finger reached the bottom of the page, the ink was completely smudged and illegible, ruined by sea water long ago. Kalen shook his head slowly, a look of profound sorrow in his eyes. The final stanza, the resolution that would seal the lullaby, was gone, lost to the depths of time. Lyra leaned closer, studying the ruined page. The notes of the first three stanzas seemed to flow like the gentle rise and fall of the tide, but without the final part, the melody remained unresolved, like a question without an answer. She looked at Kalen, who pointed out the window toward the southern cliffs, where the coastline fractured into a maze of dark, jagged rocks. He traced a symbol of a spiral shell in the air, his eyes filled with a warning. He was telling her about the echoing caves. The echoing caves were a network of flooded caverns where the ocean's voice was said to be preserved. Legend held that the final notes of the lullaby were carved into the stone walls of the deepest chamber, placed there by the sea spirits themselves. But the caves were incredibly dangerous, accessible only during the lowest neap tide of the year, which was occurring tomorrow morning. If someone were caught inside when the tide turned, they would be trapped in the dark and drowned by the rising waters. Kalen grabbed Lyra's wrist, his grip surprisingly firm. He shook his head, his eyes pleading with her not to go. He had lost his own daughter to the treacherous currents near those caves years ago, a tragedy that had silenced his voice forever. He did not want to see another young life claimed by the sea's insatiable hunger. But Lyra gently placed her hand over his, showing him the determination in her green eyes. She could not sit idly by while the ocean destroyed Oakhaven. Understanding her resolve, Kalen slowly let go of her wrist. He stood up and walked to a chest in the corner, retrieving a small brass lantern and a silver compass. He handed them to her, along with his journal. He tapped the compass, indicating that the caves were a labyrinth where iron deposits could play tricks on one's sense of direction. He then pointed to the hourglass on the table, miming the rapid flow of sand. She would have very little time before the tide rushed back. Lyra thanked him with a nod, placing the journal and compass in her satchel. She spent the rest of the evening at the lighthouse, practicing the first three stanzas of the lullaby on her harp. Kalen watched her, humming the tune silently in his throat, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, evoking the gentle sway of kelp forests and the deep mystery of the abyss. But as the fire died down, the crashing of the waves outside grew even louder, reminding them of the deadline. The next morning, before the sun had even cleared the horizon, the tide began its dramatic retreat. The water pulled back further than anyone could remember, exposing jagged rocks covered in black kelp and pale barnacles. Lyra stood at the edge of the cliffs, looking down at the path that led to the echoing caves. The sky was a pale, cold violet, and the air was freezing. She adjusted her satchel, lit her brass lantern, and began her descent into the rocky abyss, leaving the sleeping village behind. The path was slippery and steep, carved into the sheer face of the cliff. Lyra walked carefully, her leather boots sliding on the wet weeds. The wind had died down to a whisper, but it was a tense, expectant silence, as if the sea were holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. She reached the bottom of the cliffs and stood before the entrance of the echoing caves, a massive, arched opening that looked like the mouth of a sleeping sea monster. She stepped inside, the light of her lantern casting long, flickering shadows on the wet stone. The air was cold and damp, smelling of ancient salt, decaying seaweed, and wet earth. The sound of dripping water echoed from the darkness, creating a chaotic, dripping rhythm. Lyra pulled out Kalen's compass, but the needle spun erratically, just as he had warned. She would have to rely on her ears and her intuition to guide her through the dark, subterranean maze. She walked deeper into the caverns, the ceiling lowering until she had to bend her head. The walls were smooth, polished by centuries of rushing water, and covered in patches of faint, bioluminescent moss that glowed with a pale blue light. This natural illumination cast a dreamlike glow on the pools of standing water. Lyra moved forward, listening closely to the sounds around her. She tried to hum the first 3 stanzas of the lullaby, hoping the caves would respond and guide her to the final notes. As she hummed, she noticed that the dripping water in one of the side passages seemed to align with the rhythm of the song. She followed the sound, stepping over slippery rocks and wading through knee-deep pools of icy water. The water was so cold it made her legs ache, but she pressed on, holding her harp and lantern high. The passage wound deeper into the earth, sloping downward toward the heart of the cliffs, where the weight of the mountain seemed to press down on her. Suddenly, the narrow passage opened into a vast, breathtaking chamber. The ceiling rose so high that her lantern light could not reach it, and the walls were adorned with massive, glittering columns of salt and stone. In the center of the chamber lay a perfectly still, black pool of water, reflecting the bioluminescent moss like a mirror of the night sky. On the far side of the pool, carved into the stone wall, was a series of symbols that glowed with a faint, pearlescent light. Lyra approached the pool, her heart beating rapidly. She held her lantern close to the wall, trying to decipher the carvings. They were indeed the musical notation for the final stanza of the Lullaby of the Ocean Waves. But as she began to copy the symbols into Kalen's journal, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the chamber. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and she looked down to see the still water in the pool beginning to ripple and rise. The tide had turned early. Panic flared in her chest as the water level rose, splashing over the stone ledge where she stood. She looked at the remaining symbols on the wall, forcing herself to stay calm and focus. She memorized the last few notes, writing them down with a shaking hand. The water was already up to her shins, and the exit passage she had come through was beginning to flood. The sea was reclaiming its secrets, and it did not want her to leave this place alive. She grabbed her harp and her satchel, splashing back toward the entrance of the chamber. The current was already starting to pull at her legs, making it difficult to keep her footing on the slippery rocks. The air in the passage was growing thick and humid, and the sound of the approaching tide was a deafening roar. She scrambled upward, her hands gripping the sharp stone walls as she fought her way against the rising water, which was now chest-deep. Lyra struggled to keep her head above the water, her brass lantern extinguishing as it dipped beneath the surface. Darkness enveloped her, absolute and terrifying, broken only by the faint, blue glow of the bioluminescent moss. She held her harp above her head with one hand, using the other to feel her way along the wet ceiling. She prayed she was heading in the right direction, her lungs burning for air as she squeezed through a narrow, half-flooded crevice. With a final, desperate surge of energy, Lyra pulled herself out of the flooded passage and tumbled onto the rocky shore outside the cave. She lay there for a moment, gasping for air, her body shivering violently from the cold. The ocean was now a churning mass of gray foam, the tide rising with terrifying speed. She looked back at the cave entrance, which was now completely submerged under a wall of white water. She had escaped by the narrowest of margins. She checked her satchel and was relieved to find that the journal was wet but the ink had held. The final stanza was safe. But there was no time to rest. The sky had turned a dark, menacing purple, and the wind was howling with renewed fury. The storm was reaching its peak, and the great spring tide was beginning to roll in. She could see the villagers of Oakhaven retreating to the highest point of the village, watching the massive waves approach. Shivering and exhausted, Lyra began the arduous climb back up the cliffside path. The wind tried to tear her from the rocks, and the rain fell in sheets, blinding her. But she kept her eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the lighthouse, where Kalen stood on the balcony, watching her ascent. He saw her red hair whipping in the wind and waved his lantern, guiding her through the darkness. She pushed through the exhaustion, driven by the urgency of the moment. She reached the top of the cliffs, gasping for breath as she ran toward the lighthouse. Kalen met her at the door, pulling her inside and wrapping a thick wool blanket around her shivering shoulders. He looked at her with relief, but his expression quickly turned to urgency as he pointed to the window. Outside, a wall of water, easily 50 feet high, was gathering in the dark ocean, moving steadily toward the village. They had only minutes before Oakhaven was destroyed. Lyra sat by the hearth, her hands trembling as she pulled out the wet journal. She showed Kalen the final stanza, and he nodded, his eyes shining with tears. He grabbed his old lute from the wall, tuning it quickly with practiced fingers. Lyra did the same with her harp, wiping the sea spray from its wooden frame. They did not need to speak, they knew what they had to do. They had to play the completed lullaby together, from the cliff's edge. They stepped out onto the lighthouse balcony, facing the roaring abyss of the sea. The wind was so strong they had to lean into it to stand. Below them, the massive wave was growing closer, its crest glowing with a ghostly, phosphorescent light. The villagers of Oakhaven stood on their rooftops, clutching each other in terror as they watched their doom approach. Lyra looked at Kalen, who gave her a nod of encouragement. She placed her fingers on the strings. Lyra played the first note, the sound of her harp cutting through the roar of the wind like a silver needle. Kalen joined in, the deep chords of his lute providing a solid foundation for her melody. They played the first stanza, a gentle, rocking tune that mimicked the sway of a calm sea. The wind seemed to falter, its howling dropping a fraction as the music floated out over the water. The massive wave slowed slightly, its crest curling but not yet breaking. They moved into the second stanza, the melody growing more complex and emotional. It sang of the ocean's deep mysteries, of the ancient creatures that swam in the dark, and of the sorrow of the tides that were forever bound to the moon. Lyra closed her eyes, letting the music flow through her, her red hair streaming behind her like a banner. She could feel the sea's response, a resonance that vibrated through the stones of the lighthouse and into her boots. Then came the third stanza, a powerful, soaring movement that acknowledged the sea's strength and fury. It did not try to fight the waves, but rather respected them, honoring their power. The water below began to churn in a different pattern, the chaotic waves aligning with the tempo of the music. The massive wave was now only a few hundred yards from the shore, its shadow looming over the lower docks, but it seemed to hesitate, suspended by the melody. Finally, Lyra and Kaylin began the lost fourth stanza. It was a melody of profound peace and resolution, like the quiet after a storm or a mother's gentle whisper to her sleeping child. Lyra opened her mouth and began to sing, her voice carrying the notes high into the stormy sky. She did not know the words, but the pure vowels she sang seemed to carry the weight of all the prayers of Oakhaven. Kaylin played with a fierce, emotional intensity beside her. As the final notes of the fourth stanza floated over the ocean, the massive wave did not crash. Instead, it slowly collapsed upon itself, dissolving into a gentle swell that washed harmlessly over the docks. The wind died down to a soft breeze, and the heavy gray clouds began to part, revealing a brilliant, golden sunrise. The ocean, once a roaring monster, now rippled with a calm, peaceful rhythm, its waves singing a quiet lullaby against the rocky shore. The villagers of Oakhaven let out a collective cheer, their voices echoing across the cliffs. They poured out of their homes, hugging each other and looking up at the lighthouse with gratitude. Lyra let her hands fall from her harp, her body suddenly heavy with exhaustion. Kaylin looked at her, his storm blue eyes filled with pride and a peace he hadn't felt in a decade. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture that spoke louder than any words. Over the next few weeks, the village of Oakhaven began to rebuild the damaged docks and restore their homes. The ocean remained calm, its waters cooperative and plentiful with fish. Lyra became the village storyteller and guardian, playing the lullaby of the ocean waves at every spring tide to ensure the peace was kept. She and Kaylin spent many afternoons on the lighthouse balcony, teaching the village children the ancient songs, ensuring that the melody would never be forgotten again. The ancient lighthouse was restored as well, its beacon lit once more to guide ships safely through the rocky coastal waters. Kaylin had found a new purpose in mentoring Lyra, his silent presence a source of strength for the entire village. They had shown Oakhaven that the sea was not an enemy to be feared, but a powerful neighbor to be respected and understood. And every night, the villagers fell asleep to the gentle, soothing rhythm of the ocean waves, a lullaby that kept them safe. Years passed, and the legend of the girl with the copper hair and the silent lighthouse keeper grew, spreading to other coastal towns along the rugged peninsula. Travelers would come to Oakhaven just to hear Lyra play her wooden harp at the water's edge, hoping to catch a glimpse of the peace that had settled over the bay. Lyra always welcomed them with a warm smile, her green eyes reflecting the calm waters that had once threatened to destroy everything she loved. One autumn evening, as the sun set in a brilliant display of orange and violet, Lyra walked down to the rocky shore alone. She sat on her favorite flat rock, the one where the spray used to sting her face, and tuned her harp. The water was like glass, reflecting the colors of the sky. She began to play a new melody, one that she had been working on, a song that captured the quiet beauty of the autumn tide and the steady light of the beacon above. As she played, a gentle breeze rustled her hair, carrying the scent of pine from the hills behind Oakhaven. She closed her eyes, feeling the harmony between her instrument and the breathing earth. She realized that the lullaby was never truly finished. It was a living thing, changing with the seasons and the years, a continuous dialogue between the land and the deep. She sang a low, wordless melody, her voice blending with the quiet splash of the small waves. A shadow fell over her, and she opened her eyes to see Kaylin standing nearby, his silver hair catching the last rays of sunlight. He carried his lute, his storm blue eyes softer now than they had been in the days of the great storms. He sat down on a neighboring rock and joined in, his deep chords perfectly complementing her higher notes. They played together as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky, their light reflecting in the calm sea. The old lighthouse beacon began its slow, rhythmic rotation above them, casting a warm beam of light across the dark water. It was a symbol of safety and hope, a reminder that even in the darkest night, there was a light to guide them home. Lyra felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that she had played a part in preserving this peace. She looked up at the beacon, then at Kaylin, and they shared a quiet smile of mutual understanding. In the quiet of the night, the melody they played seemed to expand, carried by the rising tide to the furthest reaches of the bay. The creatures of the sea, the seals that basked on the rocks and the fish that swam in the deep, seemed to listen, their movements slow and peaceful. The village of Oakhaven slept soundly under the watchful eye of the lighthouse, the gentle hum of the waves a constant reassurance that the covenant between land and sea was intact. The sea had taught Lyra that strength did not always lie in resisting, but in listening and finding harmony. She had faced the roaring storm and the dark, flooded caverns, and she had returned not with a weapon, but with a song. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life, a truth she would weave into every melody she created. The ocean waves continued their gentle rise and fall, a timeless rhythm that had existed long before Oakhaven. As the last notes of their song faded into the night air, Lyra packed her harp back into its protective case. Kaylin stood up, brushing the dry sand from his trousers, and offered her his hand to help her navigate the slippery rocks in the dark. She took it, grateful for his steady support. They walked back up the cliff path together, their path illuminated by the sweeping light of the beacon and the brilliant canopy of stars overhead, their hearts at peace. In the heart of Oakhaven, the fire in the hearths burned low, and the dreamers dreamed of calm seas and clear skies. The lullaby of the ocean waves had become a part of the village's soul, a treasure passed down from one generation to the next. And as long as someone was willing to listen to the ocean's voice and play the sacred song, the waters would remain peaceful, and the village would thrive on the edge of the great, beautiful deep.